So I'll just introduce you. Uh, for everyone who doesn't know, Mr. Sapolsky is a leading expert in neuroscience, primatology, and neuroendocrinology. For more than 30 years, he has integrated laboratory neuroscience in field research in East Africa for baboons. If you are interested in reading his adventures, the Primate Memoirs book is very interesting. He's an author of more than 150 peer-reviewed scientific papers, of which my favorite is Science as a Double-Edged Sword. He is, authored many acclaimed books, of which his latest is Determined: A Science of Life Without Free Will. Professor Sapolsky as well received the MacArthur Genius Grant in 1987 at the age of 30. Mr. Sapolsky, if you'd like to add something to this, you are free to add.
Just to say thank you and glad to be here.
We are glad to be here for you to be here as well. So for my first question, since your lectures from 2011 have been updated or started to be updated on YouTube, I as well started watching them. I was curious. In your recent Father Offspring interviews, you mentioned that you re-recorded the 2011 lectures because the data was outdated. In your opinion, what are the three most important studies or breakthroughs since 2011 that have changed or overturned the material you taught in those original lectures?
Let's see, probably the most depressing finding has been what, at least in psychology circles here, is called the replication crisis. It turns out a lot of the classic studies in psychology are charming and important and impressive, but when you try to replicate them, they don't actually do so. And that has caused a little bit of trauma in their field. A lot of classic studies have turned out not to be replicable. So in updating the material, there's a lot of old studies that I used to be very enthusiastic about that I since then have had to stop citing. I would guess the second most interesting thing is the emergence at my university, at Stanford University, of a neuroscience technique called optogenetics, which is incredibly elegant, beautiful way of doing molecular biology on the brain of a mouse, and where you could wind up controlling their behavior. Now, one of the big problems has always been, you see some behavioral state and you see something going on in the brain, and they tend to go together. Is this causing this? Or is this causing this? Which is coming first? And optogenetics is an enormously powerful technique where you can go in and drive a small number of chemically similar individual neurons and see what behavior comes out the other end. And that has rewritten some of our understanding of depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. So that's been fascinating. I would say the third biggest thing is back in 2011, everyone was very excited. The human genome was only about 10 years old. This was going to blow everything apart. We were going to be able to transform our understanding of personality and temperament and behavior and psychopathology and neurological diseases, because we were going to be able to sequence everybody's genome and isolate all the genes that were relevant. And I would say the most interesting thing in the years since then is they haven't done that. They promised that, oh my God, we're going to have all this progress, and virtually none of that progress has occurred. Mainly for three reasons. First off, it turns out any interesting human behavior involves hundreds of genes. The first one that was looked at in detail was the most boring thing you can look at, your height. And as of a recent paper, 600 different genes are involved in regulating somebody's height. Begin to guess how many are involved in anxiety or sadness or extroversion. So a huge number of genes. When you put them all together, they only explain about 5%, 10% of the variability in the behavior. And why is that? Because what we've been learning in these recent years is it doesn't make any sense to ask what a gene does. only what it does in this particular environment or that particular one, because it differs dramatically. So from the perspective of sort of molecular behavioral genetics, it's been really disappointing. From the perspective of neuroscience and the things I think about, it's gotten so much more interesting because genes and environment are inseparable.
Mr. Sapolsky, in your in primate memoir, you wrote, "We live well enough to have the luxury to keep ourselves sick with purely social, psychological stress." That connects with Joseph Henrich's description of weight population, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, as the most unusual people on Earth. A 2021 meta-analysis found that 93 of psychology participants are still weird. If I remember correctly, also 61 were from the USA. If our understanding of human nature is built on the most atypical slice of humanity, should we even be using the term human nature at all? And how different might our models look if the baseline came from non-weird societies like pastoralists in Mongolia or Amazonian foragers?
Absolutely. And I think what that teaches us is there really is no such thing as human nature. There are human natures. There are multiple different kinds, and they differ dramatically in different social contexts.
Professor, sorry for interrupting. Oh, okay. Your camera is working. It was lagging a little bit.
Okay. I think what it tells us is there's not one human nature, and it varies as a function of genes and neurons and all, but society, culture, all of that. Here's one example that I think I was talking about for our most recent episode, which is going up in a few weeks, something called the hungry judges phenomenon. As people become more hungry, as it's been more hours since they've eaten, people become less generous. They give less money to charity in an experimental setting. They are more likely to cheat in a game. As you become hungry, your brain is getting low on energy for doing empathy and things of that sort. Whoa, that's incredibly interesting. A fascinating exception. There's a circumstance where as people become more hungry, they become more generous and more forgiving and more charitable. What's the context? Muslims during Ramadan. Because you're sitting there saying, why am I hungry? Because of my beliefs and charity and the things. So in a different cultural setting, and then you take the same people, 6 months later, and the longer it's been since they've had lunch, the more selfish they are, all of that. But whoa, like it's Ramadan. The relationship works in exactly the opposite direction. As long as you're studying American college students who volunteer for experiments, you're going to be missing out on most of what's interesting.
You once remarked, if you live in a baboon troop in the Serengeti, you've got 9 hours of free time every day to devote to generating psychological stress towards other animals in your troop. This mirrors with Wilkinson's and Pickett's claim in The Spirit Level of Mental Illness and another book, but I don't really remember the name of the book, that in wealthy societies is tied, mental illness in wealthy societies is tied more to inequality than to absolute poverty. So like comparing financial wealth. Is part of modern depression essentially a biological disease of status anxiety? And if so, should solutions be biological blunting cortisol responses or structural reducing inequality itself?
Yep. Wonderful question. One of the best society-wide predictors of the incidence of depression is really straightforward: socioeconomic status. In every westernized country looked at, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to have clinical depression. And it makes perfect sense because depression is a disease of psychological stress having broken your will. And what is psychological stress about? It's lack of control. It's lack of predictability. It's lack of outlets. It's lack of social support. And the poorer you are, the less control, the less outlets, all of that. So that makes perfect sense. So we turn to your part of the question of, so how can we cure this? How can we, and should we come up with a drug that will block the effects of stress hormones like cortisol when they're being secreted for a purely psychological reason, when all that does is cause trouble, as opposed to you're running for your life because there's a lion behind you, when it's very helpful? Can we come up with a version of medication? Maybe. That's going to be an enormous amount of work. There's a much easier solution, and it's an unbelievably difficult solution, but it still is the easier one, which is to do something about social inequality. Do something about giving people more control in their lives, things of that sort. You can use some very fancy neuroscience. We may be able to clone humans someday who are less stressed. A far more straightforward conclusion that's going to help a lot more people is to try to design societies that are more equal and less predatory and less absent of trust and all of that. It's a weird thing as a neuroscientist to come up saying social scientists are much more important in that regard.
I hope one day we will reach that level of society where everyone is equal, and not everyone is equal, but at least uh, is everyone is okay, and their
At
stress
least
level is
it's,
okay.
yeah,
Yes, yes.
a little more even.
Fourth question. Uh, in your third lecture from the 2011, the remade ones, you asked, how do you jumpstart reciprocity in a population whose starting state is nobody cooperates? If we apply that to ideology, the past century has been shaped by dogmatic systems, fascism, communism, and religion from many, many centuries that thrive on group identity. And its work shows that people moralize intentions unequally, guilt versus shame, while in many traditional societies, outcome alone defines punishment. How do you jumpstart critical thought and critical thinking in a population whose default is dogmatism? Are rigid versus skeptical thinkers wired differently at biological level? And why might one family member question inherited beliefs while another never does?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is what's the completely wrong response, which is to try to teach somebody critical thinking, to examine what they believe in, to look at evidence, for them to face that, in fact, there's no support for that. What we've seen in the United States, at least over the last decade, with Donald Trump intellectually dominating things here, is that when you have some of his most extremist followers, when you present them evidence to show that they are wrong, that these are lies, this is not true, they become more extreme. Critical thinking, rational information, science is not going to do it. I think what the critical thing is to recognize you cannot reason with someone so that they stop having a dogmatic belief. You have to understand what lack of reason brought them to that dogmatic belief in the first place. What things frighten them? What things make them feel as if their people no longer have power in society? You can't reason somebody out of a position that they were not reasoned into, can do cognition without any neurons. Or you look at something like slime molds. Slime molds are these single cell yeast things that come together and form colonies, and they show collective behavior where they can solve mazes. They can figure out the fastest way to get, and they don't have a single neuron. And people in that field talk about slime mold intelligence, cognition, and such. I think it depends on how you define it, but what's clear is when we start having AIs that are smarter than us, when we start having lab rats that can solve certain types of problems faster than humans can, we have a pretty narrow definition of cognition if it's just focusing on the brains that humans have.
I see. So we still have a long way until we know what this question is all about.
Yes.
Mr. Sapolsky, or Professor Sapolsky, thank you very much for your time. It has been an honor. Do you write any books right now? Any book you're writing?
I might be starting one, but I'm guessing it's going to take years and years, so I'm afraid to say a word about it.
Well, hopefully one day I can read it. Thank you again for your time. It has been an honor. Uh, See you
Great.
soon, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. A pleasure.